Good morning. My name is Tom Fairchild. I'm a postdoc at Swansea University. I've been working on Work Package 2 and Work Package 9 as well. I'm going to talk a little bit this morning about the role that environmental conditions and species traits have in being able to predict ecosystem functioning of coastal landscapes as part of some of the work that we've done. So I'll define a few things first. So what are ecosystem functions? Ecosystem functions are critical processes that help maintain ecosystems. These can be broadly defined as the ecological processes that control the fluxes of energy, nutrients, and organic matter through an environment. These functions can include things like the uptake and excretion of nutrients like ammonium, nitrate, and phosphate, which are important characteristics of the environment for maintaining quality. And even things like the ability for communities to filter particulates out of the water through clearance rates, crucial for maintaining environments as well. And this is particularly important for things like seahorses, like sensitive to nutrients and water. But they can also include things like stocks of biomass. Biomass is used to provide food, shelter, or other building blocks for species, including things like aquatic organisms, which quite often colonize environments. Simply by just maximizing the number of species, the genetic all species diversity of communities, can help support other organisms and also provide a buffer against changing conditions, either seasonal or over long-term climate change. In turn, these functions can also support humans, so we indirectly gain benefits from these, things like providing well-being services, providing clean water, air, providing just spaces that we can interact with and well-being values from just being in nature, as well as providing other things like food, shelter, buffering, changing climate, changing communities, climates, and the properties of the environment change. But individual species are not all created the same. Many perform different roles in the environment, from filter feeding mussels, which filter out parts, to macroalgal species, which excess nutrients and produce oxygen as well. Yet, even within these broad groups, there are significant differences in the way that individual species and groups are functioning. And some of them, there's huge variability. Efficient they can be at performing these slightly different form them. For instance, if we have 4 different taxa of seaweed, say a green ulva, a fucus species, something like the fast-growing porphyra or nori or lava as it's otherwise, well, and a common red seaweed, they all share the same characteristics in terms of being photosynthetic seaweeds, but we see very, very different patterns of resource use and so things like ulva tends to be very, very good at taking up things like nitrates and producing oxygen very fast. And this is partly because of the high surface area to volume ratio. Awful lot of surface area, which is ideal for capturing light and turning carbon dioxide, amongst other things, taking those nutrients fast. But we also see other things like with the ammonium, that actually the red species are better, and this is because they're better adapted. They have a higher density of molecules that are storage molecules that can uptake ammonium very quickly, and they've adapted themselves to use that instead of nitrate because of lack of availability environments. The things like fucus as well, they might have very, very low functional rates for a lot of the metabolic processes. They also have really high amounts of biomass and store a lot of carbon. So that they provide their own benefits and their own separate from the metabolic ones that the more ephemeral species are doing. How these communities and therefore the spread of traits is structured depends very much on the characteristics of the environment, whether this is the substrate characteristics or wider, broader environmental gradients like tidal regime, exposure, etc. And we often see strong interregional variability within these, because of gradients. But one thing we can do is we can leverage these differences in species and in, a bit closer to the microphone. So we can leverage these differences in species and in and the gradients in the environment to actually be able to try and predict what functioning and how much functionality these individual species and whole communities can have by looking at the differences and being able to use traits that predict it to be able to actually understand things. So we used a series of complex statistical models and data from mesocosms, from the literature, and also from field surveys that Paul highlighted before. We utilised some of the data from their field surveys to sort of come up with a kind of way of assessing differences between communities and between shores. One particularly compelling aspect of, that we can look at is the differences in habitat. So, say between artificial and natural shores can change the overall functionality and by having different traits and different. So using these models and the real world data collected, we've assessed a wide range of different sites across environmentally distinctive regions. And from those results, we can we start to build up a picture of functioning across whole communities and across structures. So we can see that overall natural analogues tend to fare slightly better than their artificial counterparts. It's driven through differences in communities and through positive biodiversity effects, whereby different species perform the same function but use different resources or use them in a different way and can lead to higher overall functioning. However, for nutrient cycling and productivity patterns across South Wales and Irish coasts, the presence of fast-growing ephemeral species such as Ulva and Porphyra, particularly on artificial structures, can lead to some enhancement of metabolic function on these artificial structures. However, these shores still tend to support far less in terms of the way of biomass of filter feeders and just total biomass. So there is a trade-off there in terms of these ephemeral species which can grow very quickly, particularly during the summer, and the more long-term community established. Overall, this leads to artificial shores being less able to maintain multiple simultaneous functions. It leads to an overall depression in functioning. Importantly, multifunctionality is particularly sensitive to changes in biodiversity because of increasing functional trait diversity and expressions, with functionality likely to be highest during the summer months when most species abundances are at their highest. More diversity and there's more biomass around many of the species. However, many of the species perform very poorly or more poorly in low temperatures and low light intensities. Many ephemerals die off or die back over the winter, which is likely to drastically alter the provision of function. Given that many artificial structures exhibited higher proportion of ephemeral species, it was expected that it would impact artificial structures far more than it would on natural shores, and that's exactly what we found in other analysis that we did. So we found, for instance, on fucoid-dominated shores, that artificial shores dominated some metabolic functions during the summer because of these ephemerals, as we saw in the last slide, but fall back more harshly in the winter than their natural analogues. For ephemeral-dominated shores, it was even more stark, as artificial structures lack the complex understory communities that characterise many natural shorelines. As such, we expect that promoting diverse naturalistic communities on artificial shores through ecological enhancement might help maximise functionality. So just to summarise the results very quickly, ecological traits can be really strong predictors of ecosystem functions, and we can use that to leverage, to understand the environments that we have without having to measure them at each individual site and each individual. These natural shorelines tend to harbour a greater diversity of species and therefore traits than artificial ones, which generally provides a much higher level of functioning, at least when you look across when you look at multifunctionality. And this particularly important over winter where you get these diebacks, and so you end up with lower temporal stability where you have artificial structures, natural structures. Currently, non-ecologically sensitive artificial structures perform variably over the seasons, but if we can try and promote more natural assemblages, we're likely to end up with a higher degree of function and also consistency in function and resilience. That was a very, very quick bit of presentation on some of the results that we've got. I'd like to invite any questions, please.
Thanks very much indeed, Tom.